The night Harriet, no. The night the maitre at Lakeview Grill pulled back the velvet rope for a woman named Corinna Beauchamp-Osei, the man at table 7 went completely still. His fork hovered halfway between the plate and his mouth. The woman sitting across from him, the one in the red dress, the one who was not his wife, noticed first. She noticed because she had spent 4 years learning to read the micro-expressions of a man who made his fortune in silence, and the particular way his jaw went slack was one she had never seen before. Not in 4 years, not once. Corinna didn't look at him. That was the thing people who knew her always said afterward. She didn't look at him at all. She let the maitre lead her to the corner booth, the one near the window that overlooked the Ottawa River, and she moved the way a woman moves when she knows exactly how far she has come from the person she used to be. 3 years earlier, Corinna had been the kind of woman who apologized for taking up space. She would not have described herself that way then. She would have said she was adaptable, supportive, the kind of wife who understood that a man building something from nothing needed someone steady at his back. Someone who would hold the household together while he held the company together. Someone who would not complicate things with her own ambitions. She had her degree in financial planning, her certifications, a mind for numbers that her professors had called exceptional, and she had filed all of that quietly away in a drawer, the way you file away things you intend to get back to someday. Someday had a way of becoming never, with Theron Walsh. She had met him at a fundraiser in downtown Ottawa when she was 28 and he was 35, already mid-climb, already the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He was charming and sharp, and he had this way of listening to her that made her feel like the most interesting person he had ever encountered. She knew now, of course, what that quality actually was. It was the skill of a man who understood that making people feel seen was the most efficient way to get them to give him what he wanted. But at 28, she hadn't known that. At 28, she had thought it was love. They married the following spring. Corinna had been 30. Her mother, Adaora, a retired nurse from Hamilton, who had never particularly trusted Theron from the beginning, had been polite at the wedding and privately kept her reservations to herself the way practical women often do. For a while, things had been genuinely fine. Theron's company, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm called Walsh Capital, was growing. Corinna managed the household and kept the books for the company in the early years. Spotted the discrepancies that a junior accountant missed, restructured their debt load in a way that saved the firm nearly $800,000 over 3 years. She had done that on a Tuesday afternoon while making a grocery list, and when she showed Theron the figures, he'd looked at her with something like surprise, as if he had forgotten she was actually capable. He had not said thank you. He had said good, and turned back to his phone. She should have filed that moment away differently. She didn't. By the time Walsh Capital went public and Theron's net worth crossed the line from comfortable to staggering, the dynamic between them had calcified into something neither of them spoke about directly. He made the decisions. She made the home. He had opinions about which charities they donated to, which neighborhood they should move to, which friends were worth keeping. She had learned to present her views as questions rather than statements, because statements led to a particular coldness in him that took days to thaw. She was 33 when she found out she was pregnant. She had felt, sitting alone in the bathroom of their house in Rockcliffe Park with the test in her hand, something she could only describe as terrified hope. The kind of hope that knows it might be foolish but shows up anyway. She'd let herself sit with it for almost an hour before she told him. Theron had been in his home office. She knocked, which she always did now, which was its own kind of sentence. He looked up from his laptop, registered her expression, registered the test she was holding, and something moved across his face that she would spend a long time trying to interpret later. He had said, "Are you sure about the timing? Not are you sure. Not how are you feeling. The timing." She told him yes, she was sure about the timing, and he nodded slowly, like a man reviewing a project plan he hadn't been consulted on, and said they'd figure it out. She went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen island for a long time, and she didn't call her mother, and she didn't cry, and she told herself that this was fine, that this was just how Theron processed things, that he would come around. She was still telling herself that 6 weeks later when she found the texts. She hadn't been looking. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own head, because the version of herself she was trying to protect was the version who was not paranoid, not suspicious, not one of those women who checks her husband's phone. She had picked his phone up off the kitchen counter because it was buzzing repeatedly, and she thought it might be his assistant Reginald with something urgent, and she had seen the name. Not a contact name, just a number with a small pink heart emoji, and seen the message, and the 3 before it, and understood everything in approximately 4 seconds. Her name was Quincy Hollander. Corinna would learn that later. 26 years old, a junior associate at a firm that Walsh Capital had brought on for a development project in Canada. The texts were not ambiguous. Nothing about them required interpretation. Corinna put the phone back exactly where she had found it. She did not say anything to Theron that night. She went upstairs and she lay in the dark, and she thought very carefully and very deliberately about what she was going to do. She was 9 weeks pregnant. She was 33 years old. She had spent 5 years prioritizing someone else's career at the expense of her own, and she was sitting in a house that was technically in both their names, but felt like it belonged to someone she didn't know anymore. She thought about her certifications sitting in that drawer. She thought about the $800,000 she had saved his company on a Tuesday. She thought about the way her mother had looked at her at the wedding. Proud, but with something careful behind the pride. She made some decisions. She didn't confront Theron for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she found a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a litigation specialist named Portia Attawale, who had a reputation in Ottawa legal circles for being methodical and relentless in roughly equal measure. She made copies of certain financial documents. She opened a personal account at a different bank than the one she and Theron shared. She called her old colleague, a woman named Gwendolyn from her certification days, who had gone on to run a financial advisory practice in Centertown, and she had the first of several conversations that would matter enormously to her later. When she finally told Theron that she knew, he didn't deny it. He sat across from her at the kitchen island, the same island where she had sat 9 weeks ago with hope in her hands, and he spoke to her in the carefully modulated tone of someone who had already rehearsed this conversation. He said the marriage hadn't been working for a long time. He said they wanted different things. He said he hoped they could be adult about it. He did not say he was sorry. She noticed that. She filed it. The divorce proceedings began 3 months later. Corinna was 14 weeks pregnant and had moved temporarily into an apartment in the Glebe that Gwendolyn had helped her find. Theron had expected her to lean on the settlement he'd proposed. Reasonable by some measures, generous if you didn't understand what she had actually contributed to Walsh Capital in the early years, which his legal team clearly hoped she didn't. Portia Attawale understood. Portia had a way of reading a financial statement the same way Corinna did, with the patience of someone who knows the truth is in there somewhere and is simply waiting to be found. What they found was significant. The company's early restructuring, the $800,000 Corinna had done on a Tuesday, was documented. The informal financial advisory work she had contributed during years 2 through 4 was harder to quantify, but not impossible, particularly once Portia subpoenaed certain internal communications. The settlement was renegotiated. Theron's team was not pleased. Theron himself, in the one moment during mediation where his composure slipped, looked at Corinna with something she had not seen from him in years. He looked surprised. She didn't smile. She was tired. She was 6 months pregnant and tired, and she just wanted it to be over. It was over by the time she was 7 months along. The settlement gave her the Rockcliffe Park house, which she immediately decided to sell, because she didn't want to live in a house full of a marriage she was dismantling. And a financial stake that, combined with what she was building with Gwendolyn's help, meant she was not starting from nothing. She was not starting from the place Theron had apparently assumed she would be starting from. She had her daughter in February. She named her Amara. She was born on a Sunday, calm and watchful from the first moment, and Corinna lay in the hospital bed with this small person on her chest and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something clean and clear and uncomplicated. She called her mother. Adaora drove from Hamilton through a snowstorm and arrived at the hospital at 2 in the morning. The 18 months that followed were the hardest of Corinna's life, and also, in retrospect, the most clarifying. She had moved into a condo in Westboro. manageable good light near a park. She was nursing and working simultaneously, which was not heroic so much as it was simply what the situation required. Gwendolyn had brought her on officially at the advisory practice, not as a favor, but because Corina was genuinely good, because the mind she had spent 5 years putting in a drawer was still there and still sharp and had, if anything, grown more precise during the years she'd spent quietly tracking every number in Theron's household. She had a particular skill for spotting where value was being hidden. It turned out that skill translated beyond household finances. Her first major client at the practice was a mid-sized tech company out of Gatineau, whose founder, a man named Douglas Hartwell, had been told by 3 different advisors that his capital structure was fine. It was not fine. Corina saw it in 30 minutes and spent 3 weeks documenting exactly why, and when she presented her findings to Hartwell, he sat quietly for a long time and then said, "Where have you been?" That question, asked in the low afternoon light of a boardroom overlooking the Gatineau Hills, did something to her. She had been in a drawer, she thought. She had been in a drawer for 5 years, and now she was out. Douglas Hartwell referred her to 4 other clients. 3 of them stayed. The 4th sent a referral of his own. By the time Amara was 1 year old, Corina had a practice of her own, a small team, operating under the name Beauchamp Advisory, which was her mother's maiden name, and also, she felt, the name of a version of herself that had existed before Theron Walsh. Theron, for his part, had married Quincy Hollander 7 months after the divorce was finalized. He had sent Corina a terse email through Portia's office informing her, as if it was a business communication she might need for her records. She read it once and deleted it. She was busy. She had a daughter who was beginning to walk, listing around the living room with the determined focus of a small person who has identified a goal and intends to meet it. She had clients. She had her mother, who was now coming to Ottawa for 2 weeks out of every month, and who had taken to Amara with the absolute conviction of a grandmother who has found her purpose. She did not think about Theron Walsh very much. That was not bitterness or denial. She had done enough therapy by then to know the difference. She simply didn't have room for him in a life that had become, quietly and without fanfare, her own. The Lakeview Grill dinner had not been Corina's idea. It had been suggested by Cormac Dunbar, whose name she had first heard 6 months ago when a mutual contact, a financial journalist named Bet Ouellette, who wrote for a national business publication, had described him as the most quietly powerful investor in the Ottawa Valley, and also, Bet had added with the specificity of someone reporting a fact, genuinely decent. Corina had met him for coffee initially. She didn't take dinner meetings, as a rule. She had Amara's schedule to consider, and she had a very low tolerance for the kind of professional meeting that blurred into something else without being honest about it. She had told Cormac that directly at the coffee meeting, which had been at a cafe on Bank Street, and he had looked at her and said, "That's a reasonable policy. I respect it. Is this a professional meeting?" She had said yes. He had said good. So is this. They had spoken for 2 hours about the infrastructure investment landscape in Eastern Ontario, the undervalued potential of certain mid-market construction firms, and the particular gap in the market for the kind of patient capital that most funds didn't have the attention span for. He listened to her in the way she had forgotten people could listen, not waiting for his turn, but actually processing what she said, asking questions that showed he had understood the previous answer. She drove home afterward and sat in the parking garage of her building for a minute before going upstairs, recalibrating. There had been subsequent meetings, all professional, and then Cormac had asked if she would join him for dinner to discuss a potential partnership. He had phrased it simply and specifically, and she had said she would think about it, and she thought about it for a week, examined it from the angles she now automatically examined things from, and determined that it was what it appeared to be. She had called Bet Ouellette, who had said, "Corina, I have known Cormac Dunbar for 9 years. He says what he means. Go to dinner." She had gone to dinner. She had not known, when she walked into the Lakeview Grill in a dress that was dark green and cut simply and made her feel like herself, that Theron Walsh had a reservation at table 7. She knew he was there. The restaurant was not so large that she could have missed him, and she had peripheral vision and a finely tuned instinct for the presence of people who had once had the power to diminish her, She noted him the way you note a piece of furniture you've moved around, registering its new location without assigning it much significance. She noted the woman across from him as well. Red dress, young. The particular posture of someone who has spent considerable effort appearing relaxed. Corinna let the maitre lead her to the corner table. She sat down. Cormac was already there, standing as she approached, and he smiled at her. A straightforward, unpracticed smile, and said she looked well. She said so did he. They ordered. They talked. She was aware, at the edges of her attention, that the man at table 7 had not resumed eating. At some point, she wasn't certain how much later, she heard Theron's voice behind her. Not loud, controlled, but close. Corinna. She finished the sentence she was in the middle of before she turned. He was standing at the edge of her table, and he looked like a man who had made a calculation and was now uncertain about it. There was something around his eyes she hadn't seen before. She recognized it with the distant interest of a scientist observing a phenomenon, as what happened to a person when their assumptions had been incorrect. She had made assumptions too once. She remembered what it felt like. Cormac had gone quiet and still in the way of a person who is watching something and has correctly identified that his role right now is to watch. Theron, she said. That was all. His name, the way you acknowledge a fact. He looked at Cormac. He looked back at her. He said something about it being a small world, and she agreed that it was, with the pleasant neutrality she had learned to deploy in situations where she had absolutely nothing to prove. He asked how she was. She said she was well. She asked after Imara, which was strange, because Theron had never been particularly interested in Imara, whose custody arrangement gave him alternating weekends that he managed with the same efficient biche minimalism he applied to things that were obligatory rather than wanted. She said Imara was wonderful. She said it with the specific warmth of a woman who has something in her life that has nothing to do with the person she is speaking to. There was a pause. Theron looked briefly like someone standing in a room they had furnished in their head, only to find that everything had been rearranged. He said it was good to see her. She said likewise. He went back to table 7. She turned back to Cormac, who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. She said, I apologize for that. He said there was no need to apologize. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. She said it, and she meant it, which was the part that would take her a moment to fully recognize. Not the saying of it, but the meaning of it, the fact that the answer was simply and cleanly true. They had dessert. The conversation moved back to the partnership, to a specific equity opportunity that Cormac thought Beauchamp Advisory was positioned for in a way other firms weren't. She had questions. He had answers. She had more questions. He didn't look impatient about it. He looked, if anything, more interested. When they left the restaurant, it was a cold October night, the Ottawa sky doing the thing it does in October, where the dark comes clean and sharp and total, and their breath was visible in the air, and he asked if she had parking or if she needed a cab, and she said she had parking. He said he hoped they could continue the conversation. She said she thought they could. She walked to her car and she sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, not for any dramatic reason, but because she had a habit now of pausing before moving, of checking in with herself before the next thing. She was fine. She was, in fact, more than fine. She started the car and drove home to Westboro, to her condo with the good light, where her mother was reading in the living room and Imara was asleep in her room, small and certain and entirely herself. Adaora looked up when she came in and asked, with the directness of a woman who was not given to small talk, how it had gone. Corinna set down her bag and sat on the couch and said, "We ran into Theron." Her mother's expression shifted precisely 1 millimeter. Corinna said, "It was fine." And then she said, because she was 36 years old, and she had survived things and built things, and she had learned to say true things out loud. Actually, it was more than fine. It was clarifying. Her mother looked at her for a moment, and then nodded, the nod of a woman who had driven through a snowstorm to a hospital, and who had held opinions for a long time quietly in reserve. She said, "Good." Imara stirred in the next room, not waking, just shifting, the sound of a small person resettling in sleep. And Corinna got up and went and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, and looked at her in the thin light, and felt the shape of her life, the actual shape of it, the one she had made herself, and thought, yes, that was enough. That was in fact exactly enough.